We're now on Daf Samach Zayin Amud Beis. Be'ibeha. So we have a wormy kishu, and be'ibeha means it's still attached to the ground. Asur mishum asheretz hashoretz ala oretz. According to Shmuel, even though the kishos are separate from the ground, but they're still attached to the ground, and therefore they have the halacha of oretz. It's still considered ground, and therefore the worms that are crawling inside this kishu are considered as if, according to Shmuel, they're crawling on the ground, and therefore comes under kol sheretz hashoritz ala aretz. Lema misayela, can we quote a brisa to support him? The tani chado. Now we're going to have a stira between two brisos, and we're going to reconcile that contradiction based on the principle of Shmuel. One brisa says, "Ala oretz lahotzias azizin shebadoshim." There are gnats that are found in lentils, and yitushim shebekleisim that are found. These gnats are found in chickpeas, the tolasha b'tmorim v'shebegroros, or worms that are found in dates and figs, and these were germinated in the fruit, and they never crept on the ground, and therefore they're what? They're mutter. That's lahotzi. Vitanya either, but we have another brayse that says call a sheretz hashoritz ala aretz l'rabos tolash shebeikre zaysim shebeikre gefonim, that even the worms of the stems of olives and the stems of grapes are prohibited, even though they never crept on the ground. So how do we reconcile these two brises? My love, the only way of answering it is idi ve'idi beperi. Although these larvae are found in the fruits, but habi beha ve'hashalobi beha. That which we prohibit are the insects that developed while the fruit was attached to the ground, and these insects are crawling in the fruit. And that's considered, according to Shmuel, as if they're crawling on the ground. But when the fruit is not attached to the ground, so you find a bug or a worm inside the fruit, then we assume it never left the fruit, and it never crawled on the ground, and therefore it's mutter. Gemara says, no, that's not a proof. Both brisos are referring to fruits which are attached to the ground. I have another way of reconciling it. Lo kasha ha b'peira ha b'ilana gufa. The brisa that says it's mutter is talking about those maggots or insects or whatever you call them inside the fruit. Ha b'ilana gufa. The brisa that says you're not allowed to eat those insects are referring to insects that you find in the tree itself. Now, if you find insects in the tree, for example, in the stems or the branches of the tree is attached to the ground, and then it has a din of sheretz hashoritz ala oretz, tekonami, and this is really the proper way of reading the brisa. The katani tolas shebi ikare zaysim shebi kare gefanim. Look at the language here. Where are these worms? They're in the stems of grapes or olives. Why mention the stems? Shmami, no, we must be talking about insects that develop in trees and not in the fruits. Okay. Now we get to a whole series of tekus, of Gemara Svekas, Gemara vacillates about X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, etc., and ends up with teku. Now, by introduction to the boy Rav Yosef, let's reiterate that Shmuel says that although the insects were germinated in fruits, and the fruits are attached to the ground, and therefore they're asur, but if the insects germinated in fruits that were detached from the ground, then even Shmuel is modeh that you're allowed to eat these insects until they emerge from the fruit and crawl on the ground. Boy Rav Yosef, what happens in the following scenario? Pirsha, the worm that was germinated in the fruit, emerged from the fruit, and before it got to the ground, it died. Is that considered as if it was a sheretz hashoretz ala oretz, it crept on the ground? Or should we say no, since it died before it get to actually creep on the ground, therefore it's considered as if it's still inside the fruit, and it's mut. Another suffix. Miktsasa mao. You remember the famous idiomatic expression, what's worse than finding a worm in an apple is finding half a worm. So now we have that half the worm emerged from the fruit and crawled on the ground, but the other half of the worm remained inside the fruit. A third suffix. Li'avir olamau. The worm somehow emerged from the fruit, but it's still floating in midair. It never actually reached the ground. Do we say that the avir is like the ground? Take. Now we have another series of sveikas. Boy, Rav Ashi, legag tmora mahu. What happens if a worm germinated inside a date, and the date was detached, but it emerged on the roof of the date? Now, what's different about the roof of the date? The roof refers to any part of the date's outside outer surface. And Rav Ashi therefore vacillates about the following question. The roof of the date, is it considered part of the normal habitat, what we spoke about before, derech briyasa, of a worm? Or is it a separate area? The worm crept on the ground, even though it didn't actually creep on the ground. Or legag garinosamau. Let's say the worm emerged from within the pit of the date, but it's not yet on the ground. Shall we say that it's already considered as if it emerged? Mitamra l'tamra ma. What happens if the worm went from one date into another date? That's being very fussy. And Teku, we don't know. Omer of Sheshes Bereder of Idi. Kukyoni Asire, worms in. Okay, so now we have a whole discussion about finding worms inside the body of an animal. And then we'll have worms inside the body of a fish. So Rav Sheshes says that the worms that are infested in livers or in lungs are prohibited. Where were these worms germinated? Were they germinated inside the animal's body, or did they come from the outside? And Rav Sheshes says, "My time be alma osi," that these worms came from outside. Now, wait a second. If these worms came from outside and they were eaten by the animal through its mouth, then the worms should go out of the base re'i. Maskif lo Rav Ashi, lishtachu derech beis harei. Why didn't these worms go through the entire digestive tract? And you should find them down in the lower intestines. If you don't find them there, then we have to assume that they were germinated by the flesh of the animal. Again, I don't know what science would say about this. I don't know. Maybe you get a chance to look it up. So therefore, Rav Ashi is arguing against Rav Sheshes, and he's saying that from the fact that we don't find these worms exiting from the digestive tract, it must be that they never crept, and they didn't come from outside. They came from the flesh of the animal. And if they came from the flesh of the animal and they didn't walk out on the ground, then it's not a sheretz hashoretz ala haaretz. And the Gemara gives another lishna in this shaklavitaria in the exact opposite way. Ika diamri omar Rav Sheshes Bereder of Kukyani Shari, my timer, mine gavli. That Adarab, Rav Sheshes says you're allowed to eat the liver and the lungs of this animal that's infested with worms because mine gavli. It was generated by the flesh of the animal itself, and it was never outside on the ground. These are not worms that came from the outside. Omer Rav Sheshes Avashi Pshita. In other words, I agree with you 1,000%. The ime almakos ilish tachu derech beis harei. But finally, the Gemara concludes, no, you're not allowed to eat it. Why? This is pretty disgusting, but Torah the animal was asleep, and the worms, while the animal was asleep, entered into the nostrils, so it was never digested through the mouth. They descended down to the lungs and the liver, but these were worms that came from the outside, and they clearly crept on the ground, and they're asur. But the reason why you didn't find it in the digestive tract, but rather in the lungs and the liver, even though it came from the outside, is because these very smart worms, they were able to bypass the entire digestive tract and enter directly into the liver and the lungs because they went through the nostrils. They didn't go through the mouth. They weren't eaten. Tolaim. Now we're talking about worms. Darni de bisrasire de kavre sharion. If you find larvae in meat, then we assume that those larvae already have the status of insects, and you're not allowed to eat them, even though they're in a very early stage of development. And that's in the case of meat. And he says the following: even if they never emerged to creep on the ground, but I guess they already have the status of an insect, they got to that stage, and they're asur. But the kavri shafi, if you find these larvae in fish, then you're allowed to eat the fish. This was a whole debate a few years ago. I don't know if you remember. They got fish from Nova Scotia, wherever it was coming from, or maybe from Canada, I don't remember. And they discovered there were worms in the fish. And I think the OU had already given a hechsher on the fish. So there was a whole to-do about it. But the het is based on this Gemara here. Amalei Ravina li'imei. Ravina had a discussion with his mother because she opened the fish and she found larvae in the fish. Avla li v'anoichel. You know what? Make me a piece of herring, and I'm going to eat it. In other words, I don't think that there's any iser here involved in the larva in a fish, as we saw in the previous Gemara. It's pretty disgusting to eat them. He says, I'm not disgusted by it. So there's no bal teshaktu. What are we going to do with the following brayso of esniv lasam tishaketsu? And the word vs is a ribuy, an extra word. L'rabos es hadronim shebebehema. Just like we said, the larva found in the animals is asur based on this vs. Why don't we apply the same logic and the same ruling to the fish? And the larvae in the fish should also be considered full-fledged insects, and they come under shrotzim in the Isra Lav. Omalei Ravinus responds, Hachi hashta behema b'shchita hu demishtaria. There's a fundamental difference between an animal and a fish. An animal needs shchita, and the shchita of the animal is not going to be matir the insects. Because even though we have a principle of uber yerech imo, and when you shecht an animal and you find an uber inside, the uber doesn't need shchita, but that doesn't apply to insects. Anything that grows inside the animal, l'chora, you would say, should be permitted with shchita, vahani, but not in the case of larva. But now we get to the case of the fish. Vahani, oh no, we're not yet up to fish. So we're up to the animal that germinated these larvae, these insects. And the shchita is not effective to be matir the larva. Lo kamahanya lu shchita, bisur kaime. Then they remain in their state, which is probably called Avram and Achai. It's a limb from a living creature. And whenever there's no matir of shchita, then it becomes, or remains, I should say, Ever min achai. Although we'll learn in the next perek that a pregnant animal is slaughtered, even the fetus is rendered permissible. But larvae that reside in an animal's flesh are not subject to this permit. I think because it's a separate entity. Now we get to fish. Aval dogim don't require shchita. Basifa bi'al mishtari. All you have to do is take the fish out of the water and you can eat it. And if you don't require the matir shchita, then these larvae that are germinated in the flesh of a fish, kika gavlon beteraka gavlon. If they're not subject to the requirement of the matir of shchita, it means because they're permitted. From the outset, these larvae are not subject to the requirement of shchita. They're excluded from the prohibition of Ever min achai, which is like mind-boggling. You have larvae in a fish, and it's not called Ever min achai. But yet, in the case of an animal, there's no heter of shchita. The shchita is not chal to be matir. It becomes Ever min achai. He says that the verse from which the prohibition of flesh larva is derived is written in the context of non-kosher fish. According to our Gemara, we derive from this verse that larva that grows from prohibited flesh, such as the non-kosher fish, is prohibited like the host flesh. Animals, including kosher animals, are analogous to non-kosher fish, since at the time that the larvae are formed, the host animals are under the prohibition of Ever min achai, and so too the larvae are Ever min achai. But kosher fish are not analogous to non-kosher ones, since their flesh is permissible, and therefore anything that's generated by their flesh, like the larva, is likewise permissible. It has the same status as the flesh. Ton Rabbanon, holech al gachon. Now this word gachon appears in Vayikra Yud Aleph Pasuk Mem Beis. If I'm not mistaken, the vav of gachon, I have to check this out, is long. It's the middle letter of the entire Torah. Anyway, so something that creeps on its belly, zen nachash, that refers to a snake. And then it says kol holech al gachon. What's the extra word kol? The rabos hashilshul the esadomel shilshul. We're talking about an earthworm, and we're talking about something that's similar to an earthworm, which resembles a snake. So everything, meaning kol, comes to be marba, the earthworm, because it has this resemblance to a snake. And these are creatures that do not creep on their bellies with a forward motion like ordinary snakes, but propel themselves with a forward motion like ordinary snakes. I'm sorry, they do not propel themselves like ordinary snakes, but rather by what? By twisting their bodies. Al Arba, the pasuk says that they walk on four. Ze akrav, that's a scorpion. So all this is included on the Easter of Sheretz. Kol holech, right? Al Arba says kol holech. What's the extra kol? L'rabos chipushit, ves hadom lechipushit, the beetle and that which resembles the beetle. The beetle has 6 legs, walks primarily on 4 of them, resembles the scorpion, which has 4 major legs. And there are other creatures that share that feature. Marber aglayim, that's a centipede. Zeh, I can't read it, was a nadal. Nadal is a centipede. Again, I don't know why anyone wants to eat this stuff, but anyway, maybe it's crunchy. Yeah. Ad kol, Why does it say ad kola rabos sadome v'sadome l'dome? That which resembles the centipede, and that which has a secondary resemblance to a centipede. The centipede has long legs around the entire body, well, actually short legs, and that which resemblance has numerous legs, but not along its entire body. That which bears a secondary resemblance has fewer legs, though more than four. And now we're into the parak. Tanya, we have an agadita here at the end of the parak. Rabbi Yossi, Omer, he says, Livyasan, Liasid Lavo, that God is going to feed the tzaddikim the Livyasam. It's a dagtor who, it's a kosher animal, kosher fish. I need him to tell me it's a kosher fish. Shedem agava afike maginim, posik in Eov. The Livyasan is a giant fish, described in Eov, created on the fifth day of creation, and it was never allowed to reproduce. God preserved the original species for the Seuda at the end of time for the righteous, for the tzaddikim. Tachtov Chadudei Charesh, another pasuk in Eov. Under him are pointed shards. These are all mystical ideas. Afike Maginim Elu Kaskasim. In other words, they have scales attached to the Levyasan. Tachtov Chidudei Cheres Elu Snapirin Sheporepahem, and they also have snapirin. The commentators wonder, how can anyone have thought otherwise? Livyasam is going to be served to the righteous people at the time to come. Obviously, it's kosher. So the Marsha goes far out, and he says, well, maybe Livyasam in a Havamina is not a fish. Maybe it's a bird. And the Gemara therefore wants to tell us a chidush kamashmalon that its characteristics are that of a kosher fish. However, there's a medrash that states that liasid lavo, the Livyasan will duel a gigantic land creature called the behemoth. It will ultimately slaughter the behemoth with its fin, and the meat of the behemoth will be fed to the righteous along with the meat of the Livyasan. And the midrash itself wonders about this, for since the edge of a fin is serrated, that can't be a kosher shchita. That's a psul of one of the 5 psulei shchita. It's like akira. And the Medrash explains that as part of the celebration of the feast of the righteous at the time to come, God will innovate a special permit, a matir b'fnei atzmo, of this type of shchita with the snapir of the Livyasan. So one might thought that even the Livyasan is a non-kosher fish, and once the Kodesh Baruch Hu is being matir something that's normally prohibited, in order to be served to the righteous at the time to come, then maybe it's really not a kosher fish. Maybe it's a non-kosher fish, kamash balon, based on all these psukim, that the Livyasan has a snapir v'kaskeses. Hadron alecha elu trefos. Let's just hope life gets a little easier for us. You never know what's around the corner. Okay, have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow at the same time.